How's it going, everybody? This is Cameron White with White Light Astrology, giving you guys your July 2019 horoscope for Cancer, Sun, and Rising. Thank you guys so much for being here and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. And if you are a Cancer Sun, happy birthday! I wish this month could be a little bit better for you guys, but this is an intense month, and I want to hit on the fact that while this is an intense month, there's a lot of opportunity for change that's really going to spurt into growth later on in August and September. So as you kind of go through this change, keep that in mind that this isn't forever and that there's way better things to come in the very near future, but it's about addressing what needs to be addressed here. So starting off July, on July 1st, we have Mars entering Leo, and this is a pretty good thing for you guys, only because Mars has been in Cancer in your first house in its fall for the past couple of weeks, and that must have been very frustrating. Now Mars, the planet of, our energy, how we direct ourselves, how we're initiating things, how we're really acting upon our sense of self, is going into the sign of Leo, which has to do with our pride. It has to do with our ego. This has to do with being authentic and understanding our light, understanding how we express ourselves and what is more integral for us. Now Mars is going into Leo where the way that we can act and the way that we can kind of play out things can be in a Leo manner, loud, grand, very full of light and energy. However, of course, I always talk about this, Mars is a malefic. Mars heats things up and he likes to sever, he likes to cut. Mars can bring some issues a lot of the time. And when it goes into Leo, you can also see acting out, rash and brash cannot be a good idea. Now, Mars is going into your second house, which is pretty important to know because the second house is what you have. It's what you physically possess. It has to do with your money. It has to do with your finances, your actual physical possessions and your things. What you value as well is a really important part of the second house. And as Mars enters Leo and it starts, heating up that second house, you may find yourself spending a little bit more money than you usually would. This could be a little bit tight time for finances. However, as Mars goes through Leo, I think this is really more about focusing and understanding what are the more important things that you hold valuable, that you hold near and dear to you, and what can you do with them? How can you use that, and how can you utilize what you have already to help you grow into something bigger? And that may involve spending a little bit more money, but it's also about where that's going to. And with Mars and Leo, this could be on, more funner stuff, extravagant stuff. So my caution to you is definitely watch your spending. Now, the next day on July 2nd, we start eclipse season. We're finally here. We've been talking about this forever. And I'm sure you guys have been feeling it especially well because it's in your first and your seventh house. Now, this solar eclipse that we're happening is basically the new moon in Cancer, which is happening in your first house. But as you guys know, I talk about this every month. The new moon is when both of the luminaries are focused on one area, on one place. And this is usually when this happens, but during a solar eclipse, it's when the moon's cutting out the light of that sun. And what I wanted to address here is as you have this eclipse in your first house, you had the lunar eclipse back in January in your first house. And this is going to be bringing up things that happened in January to July. And the big thing to look at is, the thing to really understand in the whole picture is what does this mean for you? What attention is being drawn to your sense of self, your personality? This could even involve your body. And what need to be addressed there. And as we have this solar eclipse, this is definitely a highlighted marker of, kind of time in your lifetime, in this timeline, kind of like this time in this area is really focused on you. And of course, we'll be talking about the relationship aspect, but this solar eclipse is kind of like looking at you like, what do you need? And what are you starting to realize that you really need to bring attention to? Then the next day, Venus enters Cancer. And this is a lot more positive news since Venus has been in Gemini in your 12th house. It's been a little bit confusing. You've been kind of questioning things. As Venus goes into your first house, this is bringing a lot of sense of value, appreciation. This is bringing, I want to use the word attractiveness. And that doesn't always necessarily mean physically, but that means, good things are being attracted to you for the most part. Venus, the planet of value and love, relationships, connection, indulgence. She likes the finer things in life. She's going into the sign of Cancer, which is about trusting, nurturing. This is about protecting, and this is about valuing the essentials and valuing the sentimental part about things. And as Venus starts to embrace that more and more, and she enters your first house, you're going to be feeling that and bringing that to your sense of self and kind of wearing that in your personality as we continue on with July. So this is some positive news, as those eclipses can be a little bit rough. Venus going through your first house is really mitigating that with some positive benefits. And then a few days later, we have Mercury stationing retrograde right in the middle of eclipse season. I already did my video about that. Make sure you check that out. But as Mercury stations retrograde in your second house in Leo, now that Mercury's in Leo, this is a pretty big deal because this is, your second house of your finances and your money, and Mars is conjoining Mercury right here too. While Mercury stations retrograde, this is going to be a big time to look at what are you doing with your money, what are you doing with your possessions, and why. Mercury stationing retrograde in Leo in your second house may be kind of viewing your personal possessions in a different way. What means what to you? Why do you own these things if they just mean nothing, or do they bring out a light in you? It's not always about money, but this does have to come down to what you physically own and have and what do you value. And I think this Mercury retrograde is really about rethinking the way you guys value things and what you value about it. Then about a week later, we have the next eclipse, and this is the lunar eclipse that we're happening in Capricorn in your 7th house. Now, Cancer, and I got to tell you about Pluto and Saturn and the South Node wrecking your 7th house, just like it's wrecking everybody's chart in some area. But as you've had Saturn and South Node and Pluto going through your 7th house, there's a lot of things that don't work there anymore that you're really starting to see that need to be replaced, and then there needs to be a new system implemented into this area for you. And this is in the 7th house, so this is relationships, but that's a very broad term when I use that, because this not only means marriage, the 7th house is specifically marriage, but this is also one-on-one relationships with the people around you. This is like lawsuits and civil things. This is very much the reflection of you. It's you and whoever you're addressing. So as we have this eclipse where there should be light on this axis of understanding better about yourself and how you implement that within relationships, through boundaries, through rules, through, being serious about things. This full moon, this eclipse is kind of like, I'm starting to realize what needs to be drawn away from here, and it's time to start actually taking action on that. I'm starting to see where to actually implement new systems, new boundaries, and just establishing a new order to how you handle relationships. And that's not always a bad thing. This is a positive thing. This is growth, but doing that change, it's kind of like, I use this analogy for Chiron a lot, but it's kind of like pouring alcohol in an open wound. It may hurt for a minute, but that sting at that moment is going to help you heal in the long run, so it doesn't hurt worse later on. And also during these eclipses, Venus on July 16th, we're going to have Venus opposing Saturn too. And this is kind of like where you want to bring more emphasis and understanding and love to yourself. You're starting to understand how the system and the way that you operate, the way the relationships work, don't really account for that. They don't really make that helpful in that sense. And you're starting to look at, this is what I need versus this is how I'm it's kind of like you're addressing a child's problems with like an HR mindset. Like, how about we listen to the child a little bit more and let them speak about it rather than being like, oh, this is the way things have to be because X, Y, and Z. Now, the next day on July 17th is when Venus is going to conjoin the North Node. And I wanted to emphasize on this because as Venus hits Saturn, that's kind of like, it's kind of like the universe being like, this doesn't really work all that well. And if you want to get these needs met, you're going to have to, fight the system for it. You're going to have to do it in a systematic way. Now, as Venus conjoins the North Node in your first house, this is that day after kind of having a better realization and more of a hunger for understanding what you value about yourself and where those sentiments lie and where that can be more nurtured and better watered if you want to look at yourself as a garden. And I think that is going to be important as we move on throughout July. Then on July 19th, we have Mercury retrogressing back into Cancer. And I hit on the value part, even though that might have sounded a little counterintuitive, because as Mercury's retrograde in your second house in Leo, and it's still kind of like, why do I value these things? Is this me valuing these things or possessing these things or having, could even be having this money? Like, is that me? Is this what I want? Mercury retrogressing back into Cancer is having more clarity and understanding about what it is that matters to you, what it is that you need, and what it is that you need to protect. This is Mercury in the first house. There's a lot of understanding of self. But then 2 days later, on July 21st, is when Mercury goes Cazimi and conjoins the Sun. This is when Mercury is at its closest point between the Sun and the Earth, and this is when it gets basically purified by fire, and it gets a better understanding of the whole Mercury retrograde mess. And as this is happening at 28 degrees Cancer, still in your first house, this has a lot to do with like understanding more of yourself. You know, we are talking about a Cazimi, we're talking about the Mercury conjoining the Sun, Mercury stationed retrograde in a luminary sign, in the sign of the Sun, and I think this has a lot to do with understanding more of what your needs are, and not about, you know, listing them down as bullet points, but going, this is the way that I feel about situations, this is the way that I feel about these things, and this is how I'm going to address it, and this is how I'm going to communicate it. Then on July 23rd, we have the Sun moving into Leo. So the Sun's getting out of your first house. It's not your birthday anymore. It's Leo season. Things are going to start to pick up a little bit more because now we're out of eclipse season. The Sun's moving into your second house, where again, this comes more down to, you know, the Sun traveling your first house is like seeing more and being more of yourself, more active with that. And as the Sun goes into your second house, this is more of kind of like sustaining that light by understanding, you know, what do you value, what do you possess, and where do you bring that into light? Then on July 24th, we have Mercury retrograding back and conjoining Venus in Cancer. And this is really positive because Mercury's kind of going through a lot right now. It's retrograde, it's thinking about things. And as Mercury comes back into the arms of Venus, Venus is still in Cancer in your first house saying, you know, this is what I value, this is what I love, this is what I'm going to protect and defend and I'm going to nurture. And as Mercury conjoins Venus, this is kind of like it communicating that and expressing that Venus in Cancer energy of like, this is what matters to me and I value this at the moment. So I'm going to put my all into this. I'm going to protect this. I'm going to nurture and care for this. And right now, this is you. This is in your first house. But then a few days later on July 28th, Venus moves into Leo, where Venus, being the planet of value and love, gets into the very expressive sign of Leo where she can feel exuberant. Venus is looking to be more admired. Venus is looking for the grander and finer things. And as Venus goes into Leo into your second house, this is looking a lot more comfortable for your financial situation, maybe getting a little bit more of a cushion back after Mars was going through your second house. However, as Venus enters Leo and goes into your second house, this really comes back down to you realizing what mattered when Venus was in Cancer in your first house, and then acting upon that value and not being afraid to express that. Then on July 31st, as we end the month, we have the new moon in Leo, and at this time we're going to have Mars, we're going to have the Sun, the moon, and Venus in Leo, and eventually Mercury will come back as well. This is a lot of energy and a lot of refreshing mindset stuff around your finances, around your money, around what you own, around what you possess, around what matters to you, what you want to hold, what you want to have, and or what you do have and what, you know, you kind of just have to deal with. And as this new moon happens, I think this is a big resetting time of really looking at, now that we've got out of the eclipses, now that we've made a few different decisions, what do we have now and what does that mean for us and what are we going to do with it? How are we going to make this great? With that being said, that's all I got for you guys. So thank you guys so much for being here and watching and liking and sharing and commenting and subscribing. I love and appreciate every single one of you, and I'll be seeing you next month.